This video will make use of a phrase that's new to me that probably ties everything together, which is invisible chain of thought in relation to what this video is going to be about. Rather than editing anything, I'm simply going to place this into an evolution of PlayStation video, taking out the PlayStation audio. Unless there's video game audio, I might give it a quick check and then use AI to separate that shit, but that's as far as I'll go. And yeah, this connects to Sam Butler and the electric environment as being recognized more so as a, I suppose, psychic visualization. At the very least, that's as much as I'll commit. It's like if the psychic feeling is invisible and AI and the internet extend our nervous system, then we are making elements that we have no visual precedent for. And that's what's going on, hence the confusion, which brings us back to, if you want to get through this moment and find some understanding with it down forever, from forever, it's pattern recognition, which obviously McLuhan was fond of, so I'll find that VHS tape footage of him talking about Descent into the Maelstrom by Edgar Allan Poe. And that's it. So here I go. Transformative infringement, which would be the ability to have not necessarily a tariff, but a dialogue about the person who's making it. I have to settle for what I'm used to with YouTube. At the very most, if someone wasn't morally outraged at the video and owned the IP and it was allowed to exist, perhaps they might want to facilitate some kind of creative commerce. Not Creative Commons, because that's like a bunch of commies, but creative commerce to keep it still capitalistic, but also recognize that a pothole affects everybody. So that's about as inclusive as I'll get.
This trajectory update about the OpenAI critique, comparative advantage in infrastructure, and aggregation theory and cheap AI was published on Tuesday, January 28th, 2025. Good morning. On yesterday's episode of Sharp Tech, Andrew basically gave me a dry run of the DeepSeek FAQ. On last Thursday's episode, we also discussed R1, along with Stargate and the slow divorce of Microsoft and OpenAI. U.S. tech stocks, meanwhile, ended the day in a fairly understandable place. Chips and data center stocks were down strongly. Google and Microsoft were slightly down, while Facebook, Apple, and Amazon were up. This ended up being largely in line with my prognostication in yesterday's article, as investors wrapped their minds around the implications of cheap AI. On to the update, which is very much a follow-up and expansion to yesterday's article. The OpenAI critique. I wrote in yesterday's conclusion, quote, "That leaves America and a choice we have to make. We could, for very logical reasons, double down on defensive measures, like massively expanding the chip ban and imposing a permission-based regulatory regime on chips and semiconductor equipment that mirrors the EU's approach to tech. Alternatively, we could realize that we have real competition. And actually give ourselves permission to compete. Double down on defensive measures, like massively expanding the chip ban and imposing a permission-based regulatory regime on chips and semiconductor equipment that mirrors the EU's approach to tech. Alternatively, we could realize that we have real competition and actually give ourselves permission to compete. Stop wringing our hands, stop campaigning for regulations. Indeed, go the other way and cut out all of the cruft in our companies that has nothing to do with winning. If we choose to compete, we can still win. And if we do, we will have a Chinese company to think." End quote. Some folks read this as being simply about government regulations, and I did specifically mention the President Biden executive order on AI, which President Trump has already repealed, but that misses the deeper point I was driving at. One of the intense frustrations of the last few years of AI debate has been the Motte and Bailey aspect of the safety question. I understand and grant the very real concerns about AI safety. That's the Motte in the safety argument. But the way that AI safety has too often manifested has been through the imposition of various cultural mores that roughly align with San Francisco politics. That's the Bailey. Indeed, If you look again at the excerpt from OpenAI's GPT-2 announcement that I linked to yesterday, it's right there in the first sentence.
Due to concerns about large language models being used to generate deceptive, biased, or abusive language at scale, we are only releasing a much smaller version of GPT-2 along with sampling code. We are not releasing the dataset, training code, or GPT-2 model weights. We are aware that some researchers have the technical capacity to reproduce and open source our results. We believe our release strategy limits the initial set of organizations who may choose to do this, and gives the AI community more time to have a discussion about the implications of such systems.
First off, deceptive, biased, or abusive language is not a human extinction level danger. Second, who decides what is deceptive, biased, or abusive? And third, whatever your position on these questions, I think we can all agree that a tremendous amount of time and effort has been devoted to arguing about these cultural war issues and implementing one side or the other of them. And by definition, that time has an opportunity cost. More broadly, I think it is completely valid to argue that a lot of time and energy in tech has been devoted to many things other than actual tech, and that the justification for that lack of focus has been rooted in an assumption that the US generally, and big tech companies specifically, have unassailable advantages. That's not the case. OpenAI is not, to be fair, what we would consider quote-unquote big tech, but that makes their own self-assuredness in their position that much more striking. Go back to the release of O1 and their blog post at the time.
We believe that a hidden chain of thought presents a unique opportunity for monitoring models. Assuming it is faithful and legible, the hidden chain of thought allows us to, quote, read the mind, end quote, of the model and understand its thought process. For example, in the future we may wish to monitor the chain of thought for signs of manipulating the user. However, for this to work, the model must have freedom to express its thoughts in unaltered form, so we cannot train any policy compliance or user preferences onto the chain of thought. We also do not want to make an unaligned chain of thought directly visible to users. Therefore, after weighing multiple factors including user experience, competitive advantage, and the option to pursue the chain of thought monitoring, we have decided not to show the raw chains of thought to users. We acknowledge this decision has disadvantages. We strive to partially make up for it by teaching the model to reproduce any useful ideas from the chain of thought in the answer. For the O1 model series, we show a model-generated summary of the chain of thought.
R1, which does show its chain of thought, has shown that this was a mistake. First, exposed chain of thought teaches users how to do better prompting, because they can see exactly where the AI gets confused. It's a superior product experience for this reason alone. Second, exposed chain of thought increases trust in the model because you gain an understanding of how it is arriving at the answer. Third, exposed chain of thought is just cool and endearing. One thing that was interesting with the normie discovery of R1 is how delightful they found the experience. And keep in mind, most of these folks are probably on the free tier of ChatGPT, which means they didn't even have access to O1 at all. But they will now. I did understand OpenAI's competitive concerns, but the existence of R1 has shown that locking down chain of thought perhaps didn't matter so much in the end. More generally, the consideration of competitive concerns gets back to my overall critique that the US approach to competition is too rooted in stopping and blocking would-be competitors instead of out-innovating them. And, of course, there is all that language about policy compliance and the horror of the model having freedom to express its thoughts in unadulterated form. Every single bit of it is a distraction, and the distractions have to go, particularly if you are worried about the actual legitimate safety concerns. Comparative advantage and infrastructure. There are two tweets I want to highlight. The first is from Ishan Wang, which I encourage you to click through and read. It is a long tweet, so I'm just going to read the key segment for purposes of this update.
Sputnik showed the Soviets could do something the US couldn't. Quote, a new fearsome power, end quote. They didn't subsequently publish all the technical details and half the blueprints. They only showed that it could be done. With DeepSeek, if I recall correctly, a lab in Berkeley read their paper and duplicated the claimed results on a small scale within a day. That's why I say it's like the Google moment in 2004. Google filed its S1 in 2004 and revealed to the world that they had built the largest supercomputer cluster by using distributed algorithms to network together commodity computers at the best performance per dollar point on the cost curve. This was in contrast to every other tech company, who at the time just bought what they were essentially larger and larger mainframes, always at the most expensive leading edge of the cost curve.
Again, read the whole tweet, but a few points. First, It's hard to overstate what a favor DeepSeek did to basically everyone by open sourcing their model and explaining exactly how they accomplished what they did. They could have, and from a geopolitical perspective, arguably should have, kept all of their progress secret, even as China built drastically more efficient AI infrastructure than the US, potentially erasing the US's silicon advantage. Second, Google's innovation in infrastructure is truly incredible and still underrated. And it should be noted, they are still by far the best in terms of AI infrastructure. Third, the Google moment that Ishan references did end up being the end of the line for specialized server makers like Sun, and significantly capped the upside for other dedicated hardware vendors who now had to compete with software-defined commodity hardware. More generally, cheap hardware meant the conservation of attractive profits drove the key point of integration up the stack to the app layer in Google's case, and scaled cloud services for AWS. The second tweet is from Rune, who works at OpenAI.
They did a pretty bad job nerfing the H800s. This is not the right lesson. There's an opportunity cost to researcher time, and if they're spending it micro-optimizing PTX to make the best of limited comms, that's something else they weren't doing. Nerfing some aspect of the hardware is never a benefit.
The most dangerous lure about thinking in terms of comparative advantage is how time and learning curves lead you to consequences that you never considered when you made your decision. I wrote about exactly this last year in A Chance to Build. I started the post by describing how US semiconductor companies kicked off outsourcing to Asia, and tied that to the fact that Apple can't make an iPhone in the US. Quote, I think that Jobs had cause and effect backwards. There are not 30,000 manufacturing engineers in the US because there are not 30,000 manufacturing engineering jobs to be filled. That is because the structure of the world economy, choices made starting with Bretton Woods in particular, and cemented by the removal of tariffs over time, made them non-viable. Say what you will about the viability or wisdom of Trump's tariffs, the motivation to undo 80 years of structural changes is pretty straightforward. The other thing about Jobs' answer is how ultimately self-serving it was. This is not to say it was wrong. Apple could not only not manufacture an iPhone in the US because of cost, it also can't do so because of capability. That capability is downstream of an ecosystem that has developed in Asia and a long learning curve that China has traveled and the US has abandoned. Ultimately, though, the benefit to Apple has been profound. The company has the best supply chain in the world, centered in China. That gives it the capability to build computers on an unimaginable scale with maximum quality for not that much money at all. End quote. Connect this to Google. What if Google had taken Rune's advice and not wasted the time of valuable quote-unquote researchers in transforming how data centers are built? Perhaps they could have waited until Alibaba did it a decade later and rented capacity. And in the meantime, they would have been a far smaller and less significant company specifically, and the entire US tech industry would be similarly stunted generally. To be fair to Rune, he does seem to be talking narrowly about the specific optimizations that DeepSeek made to overcome the H800's nerfed memory bandwidth, but I think the critique holds more generally. US tech companies, including OpenAI, have clearly in retrospect been NVIDIA's willing suckers, happy to pay for more capacity instead of wringing out their own. How many years would it have taken them to discover DeepSeek's breakthroughs independently? No, infrastructure optimization isn't sexy, but it matters. Indeed, I'd go further. Every person in AI is echoing Satya Nadella's invocation of Jevons paradox, i.e. the idea that cheaper computing drives more usage. But the reason you know that is cope, even if it's true, is because the revealed preference of every tech company was that they saw more value in one more researcher than in one more infrastructure engineer. Which again, is why every single person who actually believes in AI and Jevons paradox should be sending thank you notes to DeepSeek. Aggregation theory and cheap AI. Back in January, Doug O'Loughlin wrote in his 2025 AI and Semiconductor Outlook on Fabricated Knowledge.
I will admit, after 2 incredible years of the AI trade, I was worried that it would become long in the tooth at the end of the year. Ironically, one of the most bullish things possible happened at the end of the year, O3. While the world was focusing on scaling laws, there were still many dimensions of improvement ahead of us, and O3 gave us a taste of the future. I believe that there is no practical limit to the improvements of models other than economics, and I think that that will be the real constraint in the future. It is reasonable that if we spent infinite dollars on a model, it would be improved. The problem is whether infinite dollars would make sense for a business. That is going to be the key question for 2025. How do the economics of AI make this work? One of the core assumptions about the internet has just been broken. Marginal costs now exist again, meaning that most hyperscalers will become increasingly capital intensive. The era of aggregation theory is behind us, and AI is again making technology expensive. This relation of increased costs from increased consumption is anti-internet era thinking. And this will be the big problem that will be reckoned with this year. Hyperscalers' business models are mainly underpinned by the marginal cost being zero. So, as long as you set up the infrastructure and fill an internet-scale product with users, you can make money. This era soon will be over, and the future will be much weirder and more compute-intensive. Looking back on the 2010s, we will probably consider them a naive time in the long arc of technology. One of our fundamental assumptions about this period is unraveling. This will be the single most significant change in the technology landscape going forward.
I discussed this post on the first Sharp Tech episode of the year, but haven't written about it on Stratechery as I hadn't fully formed my thoughts on it. There is definitely validity to the point, and I think it's a big threat to the SaaS model in particular. On the flip side, non-reasoning LLMs are still great at producing content, and they also get smaller by distilling the output of reasoning models. One of the big R1 takeaways is that you can infuse reasoning into normal LLMs. More than that, though, you can also use them to generate massive amounts of synthetic data that simply teach the normal LLMs the answer to an effectively infinite number of questions. And, of course, reasoning could simply end up being effectively free. One announcement I should have added to yesterday's post was Google's announcement of Gemini 2.0 Flash Thinking. It appears to be competitive with R1. See tweet. We don't know the prices yet, to be clear. The prices in that tweet are for the 1.5 model. Google, however, is a company that actually cares about and has invested in infrastructure, and perhaps doesn't see the need for the software type of margins OpenAI and Anthropic have allegedly been earning on their API. So I wouldn't be surprised if they are very competitive. Of course, they're not open source, but again, R1 is. I can get all of the thinking I want locally for free. This isn't necessarily dispositive in terms of the long-term prospects for aggregation theory, but given that the entire history of technology has been defined by processing speed simultaneously increasing even as it decreases in price, the burden of proof is probably on those who say that zero marginal costs are an aberration. The daily update is intended for a single recipient, but occasional forwarding is totally fine. If you would like to order multiple subscriptions for your team with a group discount, please contact me directly. Thanks for being a subscriber, and have a great day. Geometry in your show notes. To read the transcript, visit the Asianometry Passport site, and while you're there, visit your account page to receive transcripts by email. I'm thrilled to have John on board and wish him and you a happy year of the snake. See you tomorrow. Things that I covered on Tuesday is this distillation point install with the there, and I actually don't think I think there's a lot of cope going on, to be totally honest.
No, I definitely think people are now overcorrecting, and at least over the weekend, there were people on Twitter basically treating the idea that DeepSeek may be using 50,000 GPUs as evidence that all of this is overblown and not as significant.
Well, here's the thing. If they're doing 50,000 GPUs, they still created this model, which is excellent.
Right.
Like that's the thing. Now, here's the anti-DeepSeek point, which I think all the people that are going crazy about China has passed the US are missing. I think it is I think that this model, these do not exist without OpenAI and Anthropic. Like there is this, we've talked about this in passing several times on Sharp Tech, this concept of distillation, this idea where you can extract basically the weights from another model by asking the right set of prompts, seeing the answer. And by the way, DeepSeek showed that. They also released where they basically used R1. They distilled R1 into Llama and into Qwen, Alibaba's sort of open source model, that's sort of Llama comparable, with tremendous results. Like if anything, one of the biggest. I mean, honestly, I think the two big things that I covered on Tuesday is this distillation points. Number one, you can extract a massive amount of capability from a bigger model into a smaller model, and they show that themselves. And I think the reasonable, skeptical view of what DeepSeek did is they distilled OpenAI's models into their model, or Anthropic's model into their model. And I don't think there's any question that happened. I mean, there's lots of scuttlebutt about the overall issue of OpenAI scrambling to block Chinese IPs, like trying to shut every possible door possible to do this, like to the extent of trying to cut off like mobile apps and like think like this is a class. It's a China story. China is basically extracting the IP from a U.S. company and then serving it much more efficiently and sort of much closer to cost and taking away margin in that regard. We've seen this in lots of industries, and now we're seeing it in AI.
Well, and even from their paper, you talked about it with Nat and Daniel. You said this is one of our best opportunities to learn how the OpenAI models work because of the way they're sort of unpacking what that technology looks like, and OpenAI has not done that to date.
Right, and you can see there's various ways that R1 fails on certain high-end tests that are where you get the sense it's where the answers are
technology looks like, and OpenAI has not done that to date.
Right. And you can see there's various ways that R1 fails on certain high-end tests.
A simple snapshot. It is an actual live vortex in action, and it, I think, is behind what we call the happening. TV itself is a kind of happening, technically. And it tends to involve people in its own vortex. And what is called in the new journalism the happening, what Norman Mailer calls the novel is history, the history is novel, is a kind of use of the total environment as a surround or as a vortex of action in which everybody, the reader and the characters are all involved. His visits to the Democratic and the Chicago conventions and so on are nice opportunities with which to show vortex.
I think that's where most of the important changes, certainly in the 1960s, took place, actually. It wasn't, I think 100 years from now, historians, assuming that the Chinese will have any interest in current history. When I'm going to look at the 1960s, in the case of, say, the United States as the era of the war in Vietnam or the moonshot or anything of that sort, I think it'll be looked at in terms of the way what you refer to as the ground has changed, the way people's lives, people have changed their ways of living.
We used to concentrate on figures, and now the ground itself has become figure.
That are where you get the sense it's where the answers are in the middle, where basically it